Hey guys, and welcome to Sila's Social Studies.
Hey, it's Sela's Social Studies.
Today we're going to be covering the actual winning of the war. We'll cover a main offensive on the Western Front. We will cover some of the events on the Pacific Front with the Japanese. And we'll cover the actual end of the war and what the Germans did to many of the people living in Europe. So, winning the war. Let's go by some numbers here. We have about 12 million GIs, or government issued soldiers, who fought in World War II. More than 1 million of those were African Americans. We've covered this before. They fought in segregated bases. The Tuskegee Airmen, remember, they couldn't land on normal airfields where white pilots would land. They had to land on their own segregated runways. So there was a lot of African Americans fighting in World War II. We also had some Navajo natives, the Navajo Indians, fighting in the war, and they were very important as well. These Navajos were called code talkers to try to prevent the Japanese from deciphering the American code. They figured the best way to do it would be have somebody who speaks a language that nobody else knows. So these Navajo Indians spoke in their native tongue to send codes back and forth to American or Allied units. Nobody else could understand it except for unless you spoke Navajo. And since nobody in Japan knew how to speak Navajo, not even very many people in the United States knew how to speak Navajo. These Navajo code talkers were very, very important. And one of the last ones that we're going to go over here, the Japanese Americans, again, these Nisis, these were soldiers in the 442nd. They became the most decorated unit, military unit in United States history. That still even goes for today. Within 2 years of fighting in World War II, I believe they earned over 18,000 medals. So it wasn't just 12 million white soldiers over there. There were African American soldiers, Navajo, Japanese Americans. We had a whole diverse American force. So let's go into really the first major, not the first, but this is a major event on the European front. And the one that I'm going to cover here is D-Day. There are lots of big battles. You have the Battle of the Bulge, you have Bastogne, you have a lot of different battles that have been fought on the Western Front. But I picked this one right here because this is one that really started the Western push against Nazi Germany. We call this D-Day, or Designated Day. It happened June 6, 1944. Now, that could have been any day in the beginning of June or end of May. The reason why it was on June 6th is because that was the day that the weather was best. This was the Allied invasion of Normandy, France, their attempted liberation and actually successful liberation of France. This was a combined attack with primarily United States, Canada, Britain, and some Australian. There was some Polish, there was some French, there was a lot of, but primarily it was these soldiers from these countries who invaded Normandy, France, or this liberated Normandy, France. The two pictures on the left here, this is a picture of what it looked like coming out of one of these landing units. Now, what you have to understand in World War II is this is the time of like heavy machine gunnery, right? So the Germans would be up in these little concrete bunkers up on the hill with these machine guns that literally shot like, I want to say it was like 2 or 3 rounds, but maybe up to 6 rounds per second. They called them Hitler's zipper guns because it shot so many rounds in such a short period of time. It sounded like, you moving a zipper up and down. And these guys, once that door opened, if these machine guns were focused up on the entrance of this boat, these guys were dead. This was very dangerous. And down here, you'll see this is actually a picture of after Normandy has been made safe from the initial invasion force, and this is now all of the supplies coming up onto shore. So the landings on Normandy were made on 5 different beachheads, and these beachheads were named Gold, Juno, Sword, Utah, and Omaha. There were, on the morning of the invasion, there were more than 156,000 soldiers, 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, tanks, all mobilized for this invasion. This was the largest amphibious invasion in history. The United States landed on Utah and Omaha, and by far, Omaha was the most deadly battle with over 2,000 casualties. Now, something you have to understand about D-Day is this was not by far a perfect invasion. You had planes, bombers flying overhead, who it was still cloudy up on top. So when they released their bombs to try to take care of those German guns, they were like a mile off. It was like for every second that they did not release their bombs at the right time, they wound up being like a half a mile off. These soldiers had to cross this huge beach that had landmines, that had barbed wire, that had everything in the way, those big metal dividers, those big metal objects in the sand that you see. They have to cross over those. These soldiers had to fight through all of this stuff just to try to get up to the end of that beachhead. So you had planes missing their targets. You had paratroopers flying in, the paratrooper planes getting shot down. The paratroopers were just landing all over the place. They were not reaching their targets. The tanks that were going in on boats were actually sinking. So this was not the most perfect invasion. It was very, very rough, but they were actually able to secure Normandy, and this started the liberation of France and the push westward to try to squish Germany now, because you had the Russians coming from the east and you had the United States and Britain and France now pushing in from the west. So let's cover the Japanese theater, or the Pacific theater. Japan really extended its territorial gains after Pearl Harbor. They kind of just went out and just started taking islands in the Pacific. They knew if they can get close enough, they would be able to actually attack the United States. The United States does not declare war on Germany right away. It declares war on Japan. It is Japan who is attacking the United States. So Japan goes and they seize Guam, they seize Wake Island. Between 1941 and 42, they actually occupied the U.S. territory of the Philippines, and that was a big one. Douglas MacArthur got kicked out of there. He was really upset. He says, "I'll be back." And in later 1942, Japan makes the attempt to take Midway Island, but the U.S. was able to decipher one of those Japanese codes, and they were prepared for the attack on Midway. The result was an American victory, but the best thing about that for the Americans is they really hammered down on the Japanese fleet. The Japanese naval fleet was really, really hurt after the Battle of Midway. The Pacific theater, the United States are taking these victories. They're taking back these islands in which they had originally lost to Japan. Iwo Jima and Okinawa cleared the path to Japan. Now the United States is trying to get closer to Japan. Are they taking every Japanese stronghold? No. They use a strategy called island hopping, which is the United States is selectively choosing the best path to reach their primary target, which is mainland Japan. So as these Americans are getting closer, the naval fleet is getting closer, the Japanese pilots start using a deadly attack. Now, this attack is called a kamikaze attack. And the kamikaze attack is basically Japanese pilots are committing suicide. They're committing a suicide mission onto the naval battleships. So they are taking their planes and literally flying them into the battleships, committing suicide. They felt that it would be more honorable to die doing that than surrendering. So they were ready to fly their planes into the battleships. And you'll have to pay attention to this, because once we take Okinawa and Iwo Jima, the United States is forced with a decision. Do you invade Japan, or is there any other options? But it won't be Franklin Roosevelt making that decision. Because in 1945, Roosevelt died of a brain hemorrhage after entering his 4th term in office. Remember, no other president has served more than 2. People were like, oh, you're going to serve more than 2? What are you, better than George Washington? And we all know that nobody was better than George Washington, right? So Roosevelt is voted in for 4 terms, and he dies in his 4th term. Harry Truman, his vice president, is now elected president, and he is the one who has to make the decision about what to do in the Pacific Theater. While this is all happening, the Manhattan Project is building in the United States. In 1941, an American effort to produce a nuclear weapon was given by none other than Albert Einstein himself, and we call this the Manhattan Project. Scientists all over the United States were secretly creating and testing nuclear reactions, and we ultimately successfully test the atomic bomb. These places were located in Tennessee, New Mexico. They were these big buildings that just nobody knew anything about. It was very, very secret. They were sworn to secrecy. Many of the scientists were working on like one part, and they couldn't even talk to somebody else. They were put in another building. They were like, if you say something, then the Nazis might find out. So it was very, very serious, this Manhattan Project. Do not tell anybody. So what do we find out about the atomic bomb? Well, first thing we find out is the devastation is catastrophic. You could see the flash of the atomic bomb from 200 miles away. A mushroom cloud, which is what you see on your left, could reach about 40,000 feet in the air. That's a little bit higher than what an airplane flies. Windows in homes 100 miles away were blown out, shattered, and a half-mile wide crater was metamorphosized into glass. That means where that half mile of the epicenter of that bomb went off, everything just turned into glass. That's how hot it got underneath there. So we now have an atomic bomb, and what are we going to do with it? Well, we meet in Potsdam, and we have the Potsdam Conference, and this has to do with Truman, Stalin, and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. They get together in Potsdam, Germany, and they try to figure out what to do about post-war Europe. When Germany's defeated here, what are we going to do with Germany? They wind up dividing it up into 4, but they're trying to figure this out. And at the Potsdam Conference, they actually threatened Japan with prompt and utter destruction if it does not immediately surrender. At this point in time at Potsdam, Truman actually gets word that we have successfully tested the atomic bomb, so he kind of knows he has that in his pocket. Does Japan surrender because they've been threatened? No, of course not. And what happens? This happens. The atomic bomb is dropped. On August 6, 1945, the atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima, Japan. 90% of the city was immediately destroyed. 80,000 people were instantly killed, with tens of thousands dying later due to radiation poisoning. But do the Japanese surrender? No. So on August 9th, 1945, 3 days later, another atomic bomb is dropped on Nagasaki, Japan, where 400,000 people were immediately killed. Japan's Emperor Hirohito finally announces that Japan will unconditionally surrender on August 15th, citing the devastating power of a new and most cruel bomb. So now that the war is over, what do we do now with the people who were in charge? Well, we have the Nuremberg Trials from November of 1945 to October of 1946. The Nuremberg Trials in Nuremberg, Germany are put into effect. They are to prosecute and punish the major criminals of the European Axis. 19 are eventually found guilty, and the punishments range from hanging to 15 years in prison. Some of them actually committed suicide before they had to serve their punishments. And the last thing we're going to cover here is the United Nations. What about the United Nations? In January 1st, 1942, 26 nations met in Washington, D.C. to decline to sign the Declaration of the United Nations. This was an organization to prevent future world wars. It was not like the League of Nations, where we let it to go to the Senate and it failed and everything went poorly. Roosevelt knew that this had to be passed, and in July of 1945, the Senate approved the United Nations, and the United Nations came to existence on October 24th, 1945, when all of those nations signed it and ratified the United Nations.